just start with the idea that this is very much a legacy moment. Leaders around the world are recognizing that not only do we have an opportunity to correct our priorities, but pandemics have almost always through history marked a moment when people break with the past and reimagine their world anew. And so what is it that we can do as shared stewards to actually make the most of this moment, to make sure that we can actually pivot from the world as we have it to the world that we most want to pass on to the next generation? We're going to use this well-being portfolio, and I'll say a little bit about its structure and details about it in a second. But the main thing to know is that it's just a practical sort of unifying framework to be able to bridge across our various experiences, our different ways of influencing a common world, and to be able to talk about that in really in a kind of the most practical terms about what matters and how the net results of all of our work ends up shaping a common region. And so the big question is, what's going to be your portfolio in the North Sound region? We do this for a couple reasons. One is the idea of a regional portfolio itself is a bit unusual. We usually think about organizations and institutions as having a portfolio based on their own narrow bank account or their own, sort of priorities. But the idea, whether we're paying attention to it or not, there is always a regional portfolio. The net result of all of those assets and where are they going, and time and knowledge and effort that maybe doesn't ever show up on a budget, but is actually showing up in the ways that we touch each other and the places where we do business. And so the idea of a regional portfolio begins to look at that abundance and questions, how are we allocating all of these resources that we have, and who's benefiting from that, and can we do better? So to think about how we produce a different future is part of this, and there are lots of trade-offs. There's not just one way to do this. We can look for maybe shortcomings in the way things work now, but we can also look for multi-solvers and synergy. It is possible to do one thing and have it address multiple goals at once, and really, more than anything, to listen to each other and who shares my values. Maybe I might learn from other people's perceptions of what they think matters. And so having a framework that isn't clouded by lots of, complicated social science and is really getting down to practical details helps us listen to each other and learn from each other's values. We developed this exercise back in 2017, long before the pandemic, and we've been learning and refining ever since, because scores of organizations and different kinds of groups have used this. I've done it with multi-sector partnerships like you. We've done it with the North Sound board about a year and a half ago. I've done it with middle schools as young as 5th graders through high school. And the reason this exercise tends to work is because nobody needs to be an expert. You don't have to have special data. You don't have to know anything other than what you already perceive by living or doing business in this region. If you care about this place, then your perceptions of what's going on in that place and what could happen matter. And that's really where this exercise starts. So we're going to kind of a quickie introduction to what we talk about as a well-being portfolio. It's got two sides of it, the hemispheres on the left and right. And on the left side are urgent services. These are things that any of us might need, sort of in a crisis. When we're under adversity, we may need temporary help to regain or restore our well-being. That can look like acute care for illness or injury. It could be physical or mental illness, but also addiction treatment, crime response, environmental cleanup, homeless services, unemployment, food assistance. There's a much longer list we can all make of crisis support, but these are the 6 big ticket items that often really are either life-saving or kind of alter people's life path in a crisis. No doubt we are putting immense pressure on the need for these urgent services now. But there's no amount of urgent services that actually creates the experience of thriving. That has to come from the other side of the portfolio, which are vital conditions. These are things that all of us need pretty much all the time to be healthy and reach our full potential. And nobody that has these conditions would ever trade them away. So the question is really how widely we can spread them. Who feels secure in a thriving natural world, and what are we doing to meet people's basic needs for health and safety, clean air, clean water, nutritious food, freedom from trauma and violence and addiction and sleep. But humane housing, meaningful work and wealth, lifelong learning, reliable transportation, belonging and civic muscle, it sits at the center because it's both a vital condition. Like that sense of isolation or exclusion is toxic. And when we feel we belong, part of a shared human family, that is life-giving. Um, but it's also a practical capacity to be able to work across our differences and actually make equitable progress in any other area of work. And so belonging and civic muscle has this dual function, and it sits at the center of this portfolio. It's also the way that the pie can grow over time. At any moment, our total assets are finite, and we can't do everything we want to do at once at full strength. But by building and expanding belonging civic muscle, we bring even more talent, even more capacity to the joint work of shared stewardship. And as Xenia just said, even one other person with an insight about what could make a difference could actually really be a significant force for change in their own lives, in their family, in their workplace. Like the level of which even one new relationship can make a difference is immense. And you start multiplying that by all of the talents that a network like the ACH can do. And man, it's like we really should not erode our goals, but really reach for the stars in this work. A lot of you will recognize elements of this portfolio I've described as kind of echoing social determinants, and indeed it grows out of decades of work on social determinants, but have never really managed to convert into widespread action. And not everybody in the world pursues a vision of health, and because their organizations aren't organized around health, or no matter how big we define health, we still think about healthcare so often, and the social determinants of framework is a little bit vague about exactly what are these contexts that matter, and what is it about our built environment or our economy. And so we're really moving as a field to get ever more specific about what are the conditions that we most want to create to generate that experience of thriving together. And so this is really carrying that social determinants agenda into practical unifying action. I will say that there are a lot of things that are not in the portfolio, and in some ways by design, because the portfolio, it's made up of distinct pieces. They're all inseparable. They kind of combine together to shape the chances for people and places to thrive. And so I think about it like a vocabulary. If we're going to tell stories about what we want to do in the world and where our resources are going, then this is kind of a practical and normative framework. There's nothing in this portfolio that isn't widely embraced as something that that people need across America and really around the world. And so, like, you won't find a concept like racial justice in the portfolio, because how our experience of racial justice manifests in the world is in some ways the net result of how that portfolio develops, and who feels they belong, and who has these various conditions and services in place for them. You won't find mental health in this portfolio because it's the expression of the portfolio together. Same for cross-cutting issues like food security or economic mobility. So it's kind of a vocabulary that can tell lots of different stories about what matters. And the question is, what matters to you in North Sound? How are you going to express your shared stewardship through the kind of infinite variety of portfolios you might design over time? And so that can be a skill or a resource to your cohorts as you talk about different facets of this work. I know you've got a cohort on vital conditions, and so that group is just beginning. I'd love to hear what you learn along the way, but really any table that is in any position to influence, sort of where resources flow, can begin to ask themselves, well, what's the result of what we're about to do on our shared portfolio? Because typically we think only of the kind of direct result of our assets, but not what it does to the net flow of assets in the region, and are we shifting our priorities across this portfolio? So just as a simple little example, if we could think about food security as sort of a unifying priority. It may or may not be important to each of you, but it just illustrates the idea that if I were to treat food security as a unifying priority, every one of the vital conditions would have some meaningful sort of contribution to that. Some people would be concentrating on ending hunger and malnutrition, and others would be focused maybe on how do we expand access to nutritious foods while discouraging junk food. We'd be talking about the conflict and violence over food and water that happens, in subtle and in some ways very conspicuous ways. But we'd also look at what's going on in lifelong learning. What do we know about hunger, malnutrition, food insecurity that impedes a child's ability to learn? And what do we know about our own food production system and consumption? Are we actually understanding how the food system works and what it needs and what it costs and who's benefiting and where the burdens are? What do we know about the food economy and what are the jobs in there and who gets which jobs? And what do we know about food affordability or fair pay and dignified lives for the people who are food producers? We'd be talking about the commercialization of food and its consumption and on and on. When we get to housing, we talk about housing affordability and what can we do to alleviate that trade-off between rent and food. It's one that nobody should ever face. And the proximity between housing and food access. Also now suddenly transportation would be super relevant. How do we get local food and what is the infrastructure that's involved in food production and delivery? There's so much about the contact with thriving natural world, just what it feels like physically to actually grow food, produce the things that nourish us, and also then look at the toxics and infectious disease across the food chain, what's going on with genetic modified food and then, running through all of this would be stories about belonging and civic muscle, affirming people's right to grow, sell, eat healthy food, and be specific about when those rights have been compromised or denied, and celebrate our cultural traditions, multicultural traditions of food production and consumption. We'd be talking about movements for food security and food justice, food sovereignty, and we'd build the strength to enact, high leverage food system reforms. So that's just a little example of how the portfolio can come to life in a story that you care about. And the only stopping rule is how much we can organize with each other. So that's really the task today, is we're going to talk about 2 points in time, how you perceive the current portfolio and how you think you might want it to be reshaped into the future. Again, you don't have to be an expert. You just have to share your own view as someone who cares about or loves the people and places in this region. So we've modified this to work. It's been done in it's an energizing experience in person, and someday it would be great to be together, but we've modified it to work really well over Zoom. And so step one, it's really just 3 simple steps. You have 15 minutes to negotiate where you think your current priorities are. You're not trying to create a ledger of every asset in the region. You're just looking for those top priorities that stand out as the places that seem to matter most right now in terms of where your resources are flowing. And so you're going to consider across every category in this portfolio where you think resources go. You're going to have 20 votes, no more than 20, and you can negotiate a kind of agreement around that. Facilitators will help actually do the mechanics of it, so nobody has to do anything on screen yourselves, just think and listen. And then we're going to turn to the future, another 15 minutes to ask, okay, regardless of where resources are flowing now, where do you think they ought to go? Let's say over the next 5 years, as a pivot to the beginning of aligning our assets to values that are going to pay off over generations. And so, again, a negotiation over 20 ways of representing just the highest priorities, and facilitators will help. And then last, it's what's your story, right? Behind this simple like current and future portrait is a story of what you think that move is, what is going on with that move. Give it a headline. What do you want your peers and other groups to know about this? What does your portfolio say about the kind of life that we could create together? So there are definitions for all of this. We'll put them in the chat. You don't have to read it right now. It can be a resource for you later. Your facilitators have read this. You can go with most of your intuition, but if it's helpful to you, this resource is right at your fingertips. So we're going to break now into maybe clarifying questions.
Bobby, before you go, there's a question in the chat that I think you could be helpful with. So the question is, what resources are we looking at? And so can I imagine for these 15-minute pieces, you're thinking resources globally? Like, where do people think resources are now? Where would we like them to go? You're not talking just like, where do you think the ACH resources are? You're thinking resources globally.
Yeah, I'm so glad you named it, because you said it at the top, but it really matters here too. we're not talking about any single organization's assets. We're talking about that abundance that you've got in this region. And it's not just dollars, it's time, energy, knowledge, in-kind effort. That's one of the reasons that we don't necessarily need, I mean, there's a time and a place to sharpen our pencil and look at where the, particular assets are. But for this exercise, think about where you think the net result of all of your sort of resources that could go toward making a common life together and helping to support this generation and the next and the next. So it's no single bank account, and it's really why your perceptions of where things matter is the denominator of assets we're talking about. Any other questions? I'm sorry, I wasn't looking at the chat while I was doing that.
It's okay. There are no other questions in the chat, but certainly if anybody has one, we could take a moment or two. You could raise your hand, you could pop it into the chat. As Bobby mentioned, there will be facilitators in each of the groups, so you can lean on us as facilitators if you have clarifying questions as well. And I just really quick, I just want to thank you, Bobby, for explaining the activity and also making some of the connections between the work and the wisdom that Marilyn shared with us. And thank you again, Marilyn, as well. So go ahead, Bobby.
No, so this is a 40-minute experience. It's divided into these three simple steps. Your only real task is to listen to each other, negotiate, and work quickly. It's a sprint exercise to be able to listen to each other.
Excellent. All right. So everyone will, thanks again, Bobby. Everyone will be placed into breakout groups. You'll have a facilitator in that breakout group. So if you haven't been tapped as a facilitator, you are a participant, and the facilitators will be able to screen share. And there is a link for the well-being portfolio definitions in the chat. Your facilitators can also drop that in the chat.
Sure. And then we would get to, the giant topics of contact with nature and toxins in the food supply and how we package food, and, and running in and through it all is these issues around belonging, civic muscle, and, the right to grow, sell, eat healthy food, but also where that's been compromised and not denied, or, how do we stand in solidarity with a movement for food justice and food sovereignty and so forth. So that's just an example. And then what people are doing right now is they're like in a sprint little task to try to characterize where they see the current portfolio, like generally where the major assets across North Sound flowing now, and where should they be headed into the future as the near edge of a shift toward multiple generations of beneficiaries. And then they're going to write a headline, and we're going to come back and talk about what, highlights of the experience of the negotiation, but also what people named as the maneuver from the current to the future. And we'll talk about a number of things. So there's all the details of the definitions are like right available. So they're right now in the future part of this. They're going to work on concluding by a little bit after the hour. And then we're going to come back together. There'll be a stretch break, and then we're going to talk together for another half an hour. The question right now, we've got about a half an hour together, and we want to lift up certainly what your experiences have been and the variety of headlines that you came to. So we just open a little space right now for folks to share what it was like to begin to think about these sort of practical questions of where are our assets flowing right now? Where do we want them to be? What did it feel like to have this kind of question before us and to negotiate with others in this space?
I can jump in really quick, Bobby. Xenia, I think it was a little bit more challenging, maybe than I had anticipated it would be. Thankfully, we had somebody in the space, Daniel, who had been part of this activity before, so was able to help us get a bit more grounded in it. But the activity went really well. Our group is incredible. I think we came up with an amazing headline to really name how our investments came to be and through what values we used. And there were some really challenging conversations. I think we probably could have spent another couple hours talking about. investments? What does it mean when you remove investments from certain spaces? What does it mean if decision makers see the ways in which we have talked about investments in the future? Will that change the decisions they make about where funding goes? I mean, really powerful conversations.
That's great. I'm seeing some in the chat. Meg, can you speak to your comment?
Yeah, sure. And also anybody in my group who wants to hop in. We didn't actually get to discuss our headline a ton. I just was taking notes as we went. So please, please, the folks from my group, jump in if you'd like to correct or add. But it was a great conversation, and we did talk. There were folks who elevated that, because we had somebody from Orcas Island and said, housings are different in Orcas than in other places. So where sources are allocated now may, it just, there was just a little bit of distribution that depended on where you were. And we wanted to elevate that. And then we talked about that investing in some things would impact others. And so it was a great conversation around where to put those future allocations, because we talked about how there's certain things that would impact others, because we talked a lot about prevention, being able to maybe putting money into prevention resources can then maybe break some cycles, break some systemic issues. Anyway, thanks
lovely points. This issue of the how narrowly or broadly we're thinking about the North Sound, things can look different from different points of view, and so a really important point to listen with neighbors about what their experience looks like, situated in a different space. And the interdependencies you're describing are sometimes really hard to see on ordinary budgets, but that's really, I love the way you put it about breaking cycles, because it takes sort of an interdependent resource portrait to be able to see where a new investment could actually have accumulating benefits over time as it plays out over a life course or certainly over generations. That's great. Delphina, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, I think that, our group was similar to a lot of the groups where we were focused on trying to put more money upstream, more resources upstream, but also recognizing the overlap potential. So when we're looking at, for example, homeless services, it's like, humane housing, if that were the focus, as opposed to sort of the less emergency services and more community based services, that could be really helpful. But I think overall, something that I'm feeling kind of perplexed by is, the group that's at this table, it's a really beautiful space of people that are invested in social outcomes and building communities. But I think something that is perpetually alarming to me is that we do live in a capitalist society where the 1%, there are enough resources. I really truly believe that. It's how the resources are distributed. So I think that trying to think about how to create longer social change and also think about leveraging people power is really important, because I think that creating new models or looking at historical models that have worked like cooperatives and trying to approach some of these changes in that way might be part of the solution. Otherwise, I'm just kind of curious, how we change a system where there are enough resources, and ultimately the 1% are deciding how those resources are distributed.
So good. And it connects to this comment in one of the headlines here is, I guess it was from Nika, about flexing civic muscle in order to do things, to invest in places we haven't really had the strength to do in the past. Nika, can you say a little more about that one?
It's Nika.
Nika, excuse me.
So our group was just really focused on looking at the upstream and moving the money to the biggest areas we put it in was basic needs for health and safety and humane housing, but also talking about how the work that's already being done around civic muscle and belonging are really the foundation for those vital conditions and for promoting that. And so, that's how we came up with our title about upstream investment.
Excellent. I've seen some other hands. Is it Ara?
Yes, it's Ara. Thanks. Thanks for calling on me. I just wanted to share a little bit about my group experiences. So first off, I don't know if any other groups did this, but one of the first things I suggested and we went with was there were 20 resources and we had 6 total folks minus 1 for the facilitator. So we just divided them evenly and each person had 4. And oh my goodness, my words are escaping me. My reasoning behind that was like, well, we only have 40 minutes. We need to be able to I felt like it was the most equitable way. So I don't know if other groups did that. And then we also talked a little bit more about like how we perceive some of these categories, like specifically meaningful work and wealth. We all had different ideas about what that actually meant. And it was really interesting to hear different perspectives from folks. Like one of them, I'm sorry, the names are escaping me, but I think it was Alex had mentioned that like to them, it was like financial literacy, making sure that you're teaching the youth, and we're talking about future allocations, like teaching the youth more about financial literacy. What do you do with the money you do have, and then for me, it was like, I think we should be able to do meaningful work and be paid for it, because the nonprofit public services sector is like very much like, I believe, underfunded. Like people who are in public services or teachers, like folks who do this meaningful work that really pulls a lot out of them, we don't get paid a lot. And I think that is something, when I saw meaningful work and wealth, I was like, oh, if I'm doing meaningful work that resonates with me, I shouldn't have to compromise to our capitalist society. It's like, I need to go and make more money. I have to compromise my values here and there. It's like, I should be able to pour myself into my work in a way that meets my capacity, and I get paid and compensated for it fairly. So it was just really interesting to see the different ways we saw that. And we actually ended up making it a little bit clearer as well. Like we put like in parentheses, like, this is what we mean when we talk about meaningful work and wealth. So I just want to share some of those perspectives.
I love it. It's, there's such a spectrum to each of these things. So financial literacy in a system that isn't really built for everybody is, a really powerful strategy. And at the same time, we have to restructure the governing values of that system as well. And so it's not an either or. It really can be a sequence of actions that really leads to a persistent movement. I love what you're saying. Liz, I see your hand.
Hi, Bobby, and I have a question, and I'm probably going to be raising an issue that's come up. I'm going to say it's come up for 4 years, but it's come up certainly in the last 4 weeks. So we had a participant in one of the work groups who felt really challenged in understanding how this exercise, like a beginning and an end, like this isn't the exercise, and these people aren't the folks making decisions who's on this call now. Just feeling like potentially it might further marginalize and accentuate the folks who don't have a voice in this process. And just if you can perhaps talk about like how this actually gets from the people who typically get to be in a room like this to community, and how community, how we can both assure that there are voices that become part of putting handprints and fingerprints on this. But just like giving a context to this exercise that doesn't make it sound like this is the end all be all.
No, in fact, if anything, it helps make it more acutely aware whose voices we need to hear from. I'll tell a quick story. We did this exercise several years ago with a group in Florida, a multi-sector partnership, who had a stewardship council as their core. And then they turned around, we had helped them sort of do this in a small group way. And then they turned around and did it in neighborhood clusters across the region, facilitated by themselves without us, precisely for that reason. And they had a widespread commitment to build neighborhood-based teams of lived and learned experience. And so the initial discussion made it very clear that many people who have a legitimate and important view on the scene in their county needed to also have space to think about it. And that led to a wave of mini grants that were to people who had sort of micro neighborhood solutions to things, and a very different kind of grant making that's occurred over the last several years, all kind of traced to the genesis of a discussion about where they see the greatest value. So I love that. And, even in your own experience, right? The board did it a few years ago, but here we are with 150, and it's not crazy to think that it may not be this exact experience, but some of the insights and implications of this could turn into conversations across the cohorts or in other spaces as you think about what does it mean to have the, to either influence or maybe significant control over the purse strings of resources.
Yeah, it just, and this is potentially contextual, but for almost 6 years, all the 9 ACHs are always asked, how do we do community engagement? And I personally have struggled because I'm just not exactly sure how much community members need to understand what an accountable community of health is. So we have erred on the side of building capacity at our community organizations for them to do that. Like, it's more important that community members know who those go-to organizations are. But out of our small work group, kind of a notion got tested and perhaps affirmed for me that there could be ways for, whether it's this exercise or some other exercise, that every one of our partners is expected to go out to community and both gather input and potentially truth test some of, any of the assumptions that we might have, that just kind of makes this richer and deeper, reaching out into community. But, I just don't want to have anybody think like this is as far as this goes, because this was an exercise and an example of the exercise. And but just really, I appreciate, but this has come up for us multiple times, and just appreciated getting that note in the chat today to bring that up here.
Oh, that's great. Stacy, your point about it's sometimes this regional portfolio is invisible. Can you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, and invite my group members to actually share their voice. And as I think about that, just sort of that next step of, it was a little bit of an aha, right? That it's like, boy, we've never really thought about it as sort of a full regional portfolio, and where are all the flows? We have a sense of from where we sit and the work that we do, and perhaps what we learn, through the network. But where are those dollars and other investments and energies, as you named in a holistic definition of resource, and how might we work together to make that more visible?
Yeah, that's great. Beth, I want to get to your comment in a second, but on the note about making the invisible more visible and valued, let's take a quick peek at the average across all of your groups. We were able to tally that up really quickly, and like all averages, this kind of masks a lot of variability, and Beth's point about what it means to be able to kind of hold that variation and not lose its richness. At the same time, we can also look and see, does this pattern teach us anything about across what we had 24 groups, and the way this works is that the bottom section are those urgent services, and the darker colors are the places where the greatest priorities were perceived. And so this tells a little bit of a story of resources being overwhelmingly directed at acute care and addiction treatment, about evenly with the other urgent services. And then there's a couple of the vital conditions that kind of rise up, basic needs for health and safety and humane housing. But when you turn to the future, this decisive shift on where the priorities ought to be, unequivocally in the vital conditions as a cluster, led by basic needs and humane housing and meaningful work, which are often a trio. And then, right up there is belonging and civic muscle and the others. I don't want to lose the this kind of heavy emphasis on addiction treatment. This is a moment of great pain, and addiction is a response to a society that is, where people don't feel they fit, and or so that, to the point that was made earlier about the interdependency of these things, it in some ways the divestment from these urgent services is creating the pressures and the pain that we see in all of these urgent services, and addiction most poignantly in some ways. So any other sort of general observations about this pattern? We'll turn back to the richness and what this average may be obscuring. But I just wanted to share a snapshot glimpse of what you as as a network, an imperfect network, as Liz said, but still nonetheless, like, does this signal feel meaningful to you in any way?
Looks like Mateo has their hand up.
Okay, great. Please, Mateo, and I'll stop sharing.
Mateo,
you're
you can
muted.
unmute.
Thank you all.
you.
A true Zoom moment for myself. I think the one thing that came up for us in this conversation that I wanted to name as a collective, right, is just the framing that there's a cap, right, to the number of resources that we have access to, right, automatically subscribes us to like a scarcity mindset. And so we as a collective decided to reframe and say like, no, I think our conversation is better spent, right, in an abundance framework, saying, right, like, rather than have all of these different areas compete for resources, right? What do each of these areas need, right? How much money is needed for us to sustainably, right, reach a point where housing is no longer a crisis, right? How much money is needed for us to get to a point where healthcare is guaranteed, right? And I think like that is where we wanted to shift our conversation, because I think the main intention of this cohort has been presented to me is to identify areas, right, that we can begin working towards. And I think we've already done that. I think we've named why all of these are areas. And I think this activity for me highlighted in particular that we are convincing ourselves, right, like that we have to operate within these limits. And I don't think that that's the case. And I actually think, right, that is antithetical to the work that we're trying to do, which features equity, right? Like equity is not saying that everyone gets the same thing. Equity is making sure everyone has what they need to reach the point that they need to be at. And so I think, yeah, like a lot of that came up for us in this conversation. And I think the one thing that Liz and I had like a little volley back and forth with is, right, like the growth for one area should not come at like the detriment or like the stagnance in growth for another area, right? Like how do we find ways to continue to invest in all of these areas simultaneously? Because I found, right, the way that the activity was structured, I saw folks in my group, right, saying like, oh, I feel like we should prioritize this, or this is related to this. I feel like we should prioritize this. This is related to this, but pausing for a second and naming as a collective, right? All of them are connected, right? And so investing in one and divesting in another is not going to actually contribute to our own growth. And so like, with all of that said, I just wanted to name that for us as a group as we continue to decide, right? Like, where should we be spending money? And I think the answer is like, not where we should be spending money, but like how we should be spending it intentionally. So thank you.
Yeah, it's a lovely, lovely comment.
Marilyn?
I don't have a comment, but I just wanted to ask the group if I could do a kind of a closure of the work from this morning and a blessing for before we go to lunch.
Thank
If
you. That
that's
would be like,
okay.
that would be amazing.
Oh, 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 Aşka.